Despite a lot of disappointing results, the Michigan State Spartans can, of course, put a good stamp on the season and make things a whole lot better if they could find a way to upset arch rival Michigan in the big house coming up on Saturday. Got Ryan O'Blennis from the Only Colors on SB Nation here to talk up the Michigan State Spartans. Ryan, how are you?
I'm doing good. Excited to talk about the matchup here.
Yeah. So I don't know that we've talked this season since a lot of off-season conversations coming off 11-2 in a Peach Bowl victory. And certainly there were thoughts that this season may not reach those heights, but at the same time that it would be a team that's contending in the Big Ten and headed toward postseason play for sure, and really hasn't looked anything close to what we saw last year.
Yeah, I think most Michigan State fans probably anticipated a small step back. Obviously, you lost Kenneth Walker III, who was a generational talent running back that you can't really replace, and several other key starters and contributors from last year's team. But there was still a thought that this team would make some noise. Mel Tucker was leading it in the right direction. I think we ran a survey early in the season and about how many wins did Michigan State fans expect this season, and the majority of the answers were 10 wins, and I think 9 wins was the second most. So obviously there were still some pretty high hopes, and it hasn't really been the season that Michigan State fans, or I think many in the program, expected.
There were a lot of questions about surrounding Mel Tucker when he got the job. Of course, he had success at Georgia as an assistant. He goes to Colorado, only spends one season in Boulder, and goes 5-7. So coming off one successful campaign in Michigan State after the COVID year, and then now with the struggles that the team is enduring, is there any thought that, okay, a lot of money was given to this guy, and he's really only had one huge season. So maybe Michigan State jumped a little too quickly to keep him locked down?
I don't necessarily think so. I think it was the right move at the time. There was a lot of talk that LSU and other schools were going to pursue him. And, the majority of his contract is, privately funded. So it's not coming straight out of Michigan State's athletic department's budget. So, that's not a big concern for me. I know people have kind of questioned his contract, and obviously when you're making that kind of money, regardless of where it's coming from, to do this job, then the more is expected out of you than this 3-4 start that Michigan State has had. And, obviously at the very least, you would expect this team to make a bowl game when, your head coach is making $9.5 million a year. So, I think there's definitely a little bit of give and take there, but I don't think it's a major concern.
Brian, the first time I saw Michigan State extensively was the game at Washington. I saw a little bit in the early non-conference games, but they go to Washington, and a lot of people made much of Michael Penix going off for close to 400 yards and all of that, and certainly that was a huge factor in the game, but that's not something we didn't get accustomed to seeing on occasion last season out of the secondary. I was more alarmed at that point that they couldn't run the ball and that Peyton Thorne was running for his life constantly. And I was thinking, this team is not prepared, at least based on this one sample size in Seattle, in the trenches, to be the type team that you would think that they need to be in the Big Ten.
Yeah, like I mentioned, last year's team lost a lot of key contributors, and that included I think 5 or 6 guys on the offensive line. Because, in the 2021 season, Michigan State basically had 2 units of different 5-man groups they could use on the offensive line. And this year, there's a lot more limited depth. They rotate in a couple of guys, but it's mostly been the 5 starters playing, with guys like Brian Green or Brandon Baldwin rotating in. But I would say they have been better in pass protection. That Washington game, Thorne was under a lot of pressure, but they hold up better that way. You brought it up too. It's the running game that's really been a struggle for the offensive line. They haven't been able to create a lot of holes, and when they have created those holes, Jalen Berger, Jarek Broussard, those guys haven't displayed great vision to hit those holes. Honestly, I think Elijah Collins has been, the best looking running back on the team this year, and he's only gotten limited touches, which has been kind of a point of frustration for Michigan State fans as to why, Collins isn't getting more touches. I thought Berger ran hard against, his former team, Wisconsin, before the bye week, and I think that he still has a lot of potential there. So I don't think it's all on the offensive line, but they've definitely kind of struggled there to open up the holes. And, it's definitely a different unit from last year when you had, I think, 10 or 11 guys who played over 500 snaps.
We got Ryan O'Blennis on the line from SB Nation's The Only Colors. Michigan State goes to the Big House, takes on Michigan coming up, where Mel Tucker is 2-0 against Michigan. Jim Harbaugh, I believe, has dipped to 3-4 against the Spartans. So coming at that direction, Mel Tucker's obviously going to have a lot of fan favorites if he continues this streak against Michigan. And this is the kind of game that can salvage a season to a certain extent. And Jim Harbaugh in the other direction can ruin what they have going at Michigan to a certain extent, although it didn't last year. But still, does this game just counts for one in the standings, but is it a lot more than that?
Yeah, I always think that Michigan State obviously gets up for this game. There's always been that kind of backhanded disrespect from the Michigan program toward Michigan State. Even this week they've had players come out and say, they're going to show them no mercy, blow them out, whatnot. And Mel Tucker's told his players to kind of keep quiet about that. Don't give them any bulletin board material. I guess Tucker has showed them some bulletin board materials from what Michigan's been saying. This is a rivalry that runs really deep because, going all the way back to when, Michigan State was first trying to join the Big Ten, Michigan didn't want them to do that. They tried what they could do to keep them out. So, it goes deeper than just on the field, and it certainly seems that Michigan State over the last several years has taken the rivalry more seriously. A lot of Michigan fans would say that, Ohio State's their chief rival, which is true, but they kind of disregard Michigan State and kind of downplay the rivalry, even though, I think it does mean a lot to them too. And that's kind of what irks at Michigan State fans, I think, is kind of that unwillingness to kind of, I guess, admit that the rivalry is on the same level for them. And, obviously that isn't all Michigan fans or not everybody coming from the program, but that's kind of what the general feeling is from Michigan State fans and the Michigan State program itself. They know that kind of disrespect and that chip on the shoulder, and they're always going to bring that kind of tough attitude. That was another question that we asked this week in a different survey. We don't have the results back yet, but, what's more important to you, kind of, beating Michigan this year or making a low-level bowl game after a disappointing season? So, I do, as you mentioned, it's only one game, but it kind of counts more at a morale level if you're able to beat Michigan. I think if you're Michigan State, there's a lot of different factors that go into it, and people are going to look at it different ways based on their own thought patterns. But certainly, this is always a game that Michigan State has circled on on its schedule that they're going to get up for. That's probably their biggest game of the regular season every year.
And it also has to irk Michigan State fans because this obviously is a legitimate rivalry that is one of the best in college football. And it gains that legitimacy from some of the things that you mentioned about the origin of Michigan State's entry into the league. When you've got two programs that are in the same state, there's one check mark right there. Then they play in the same conference. There's another check mark. They play in the same division. There's another check mark. And then on top of that, it'd be one thing if, let's say, Michigan was dominating this series and they can look down at Michigan State. However, it's the other way around, at least in the recent past. I think it's 10 out of 14 for Michigan State in this series. So at this point, the Michigan that kind of condescending look would just be a matter of this is who we are and what we do regardless, because it appears as though they could lose 20 in a row, and there's not much backing up their arrogance at this point. It's just based on their stance rather than reality.
Exactly. And like I said, it's not all Michigan fans. It's not all coming from the
Sure.
program, but that's the general kind of
Yeah.
consensus that Michigan State fans get, and that's why they take this so seriously.
So I'm guessing that Michigan State fans do not root for Michigan when they go play outside the conference.
No, not generally. I mean, maybe if it helps Michigan State standing in some way or helps them
Yeah.
get into a bowl game, but even I remember last year, for example, the Big Ten championship game, Michigan versus Iowa. Was another question that we asked was, if Iowa ends up winning this game, it could very well bump Michigan State out of a New Year's Six bowl. Would you rather see Iowa win just to spite Michigan, or would you rather Michigan win to kind of assure that Michigan State gets into a New Year's Six bowl, which obviously they did, but the overwhelming majority of the responses, I think it was like 87% of our poll or something like that, said that they'd rather see Michigan lose, which I didn't quite feel the same way in that instance. But yeah, so I mean, it's very rarely that you'll see Michigan State fans rooting for Michigan.
Is the defense playing any better? Of course, they are coming off a game against Wisconsin 2 weeks ago in which both teams were struggling coming into the game. Michigan State pulls out the win in double overtime, and then we see Wisconsin turn around and play their best game of the season. They dominate Purdue, who'd been playing good football. So you kind of connect these dots, and is Michigan playing a little bit better based on that performance?
Yeah, so I think what you saw in the Wisconsin game was that Michigan State was playing kind of a run heavy team against Wisconsin. So they moved from their normal base 4-2-5 set to a more 4-3 set. And they took Jacoby Windman, who had been playing kind of as a stand up edge rusher defensive end for most of the year. And they put him back to his natural spot at linebacker. And he had a great game. Ended up winning Big Ten Player of the Week for the third time this year. I think he was the first Spartan to ever do that. And he was just flying all over the field from the linebacker position. He made a really good interception that set up a Michigan State touchdown, and he also made he forced a fumble in double overtime that gave Michigan State the ball back and the opportunity to win, which they ended up doing. So yeah, I mean, I think you saw the effort in that game certainly, and you saw the adjustments being made in I think in the second half in the Maryland game, the defense played a lot better too. Defensive coordinator Scotty Hazelton's been under a lot of scrutiny this season, and most of it is rightfully so. But at the same time, when the players aren't making the plays, it's kind of hard for him to do anything. So you've seen him change some things up, like early in the season and a lot of times last year, Michigan State would line their cornerbacks up several yards off of the wide receiver pre-snap at the line of scrimmage, and they would just take advantage of that soft zone and that cushion. And lately, you're seeing a little bit more press man. You're seeing a little bit more disguise and coverage. I think pre-snaps. Even sometimes like a nickelback blitz I saw in there once. So they are trying different things. It's not always been successful. As you mentioned earlier, the pass defense has been an issue ever since last season. Overall, it's been just as bad, if not worse, this year. They looked a lot better against Wisconsin. I think they held Graham Mertz to something like 131 yards, and I want to say that was the lowest passing yards total allowed by Mel Tucker, something along those lines. So there have been improvements made. There's certainly still a lot of work to do. I think Michigan's going to be an interesting challenge because they can do a lot of things on the ground game, obviously, but I think where J.J. McCarthy is dangerous at is the intermediate kind of short and intermediate passing. His deep ball is still a little bit questionable. He's a really talented player. He's going to challenge this team. And another thing about the defense, too, is that they've just been decimated by injuries. They lost Darius Snow in the first game of the year. For the season, he was a guy who played safety and nickelback last year, and they brought him down to linebacker this year. They also lost Xavier Henderson in that season opener to Western Michigan, and he finally just came back against Wisconsin. And you could see the boost that he gave the defense, because not only is he the best option at safety, he's also the team leader who quarterbacks that defense and leads the entire team, vocally and by example. And having him back, and they got Jacob Slade back that game, defensive tackle, who makes a huge difference in the interior of that line and generating a push and being able to stop the run. Kendall Brooks missed the Wisconsin game, but I think the hope is that he'll be back for the Michigan game to pair him with Henderson at safety. Jeff Petrowski and Chris Bogle, defensive ends, have been out. Marquis Lowry's a cornerback who's been out. So hopefully Michigan State was able to use this bye week to get a lot of guys healthy and back. I don't think we'll see Bogle, but possibly Petrowski and some of those other guys will return this week. And, that's going to be huge for Michigan State if the defense is healthy.
Mel Tucker looks to go to 3-0 against the Maize and Blue. They get together at Michigan coming up on Saturday. Check out Ryan's work and the rest of the crew there at The Only Colors on SB Nation to get yourself set for Michigan State and Michigan on Saturday. Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by to break things down.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.